Good evening. Welcome, everybody. As you're settling in, old friends and new, nice to have you here at our first Appreciating Diversity film series, film discussion in 2022, and that's kind of a mouthful. I'm Denise Bostrom, a proud member of Appreciating Diversity film series. For those of you who are new, ADFS has been hosting film screenings of important and critically acclaimed documentaries since 1997, and this year marks our 25th anniversary. Typically, our screenings are in person, but since 2020, with COVID, we're here. Welcome on Zoom. Hopefully, in a few months, we'll return to in-person screenings. We all really would like that. I'm sure you would too. This evening's discussion features the important and, in my mind, trenchant documentary Coded Bias, directed by Shalini Kantaya. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2020. It's been honored at multiple film festivals, including South by Southwest, the San Francisco Film Festival, and it was featured as one of the hot docs in the New York Times that year, 2020. If you haven't seen the film yet, you still may do so using the link and passcode provided to you when you registered, or it's on Netflix. So for tonight's discussion, we are pleased and honored to have ACLU attorney Matt Cagle here. Matt's going to discuss and help explore some of the key points raised in the film. His specialty is technology and civil liberties, which includes digital rights issues, privacy, surveillance, and free speech. His focus is to ensure that our current and evolving digital systems, whether on private platforms or public, are discussed and debated publicly and implemented with an oversight to ensure equality and justice. His work includes assessing the use of surveillance technology by local police and promoting best practices for online platforms. And if this isn't a lot, I don't know what is. So Matt holds degrees from the University of Arizona and Stanford Law, where he was a member editor of the Stanford Journal of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. In 2019, the California Daily Journal named Matt one of the top artificial intelligence lawyers in the state. Thank you so very much for joining us, Matt Cagle. We're going to begin with some questions from Matt and then take questions from you, our lovely audience members. So be sure to submit your questions using the Q&A option on Zoom. We'll hopefully get to as many as possible. So Matt, I'll wait till you stop drinking. We're going to start with basics and look at artificial intelligence and the algorithms created by programmers to run AI. So can you tell us briefly what algorithms are and how bias gets programmed into them?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Denise, and the film series. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to talk about the work that I do here at the ACLU of Northern California. And as you were saying, my work is at the intersection of civil rights and civil liberties and surveillance. As so many of you know, technology is part of everything we do these days. It intersects with all of the ACLU's work, whether you're talking about open meetings in the era of COVID and Zoom, decisions about people being released on bail and the algorithms that are being incorporated into those systems. It even impacts the privacy rights and the rights of women and trans folks to seek out gender affirming or reproductive health care because their information may be misused or exploited in ways that harm their right to seek health care or to do it safely. But to answer your question, an algorithm is essentially a sort of formula that has inputs and that it has outputs in sort of most basic sense. In the movie, they talked about there's sort of an algorithm. One version of it is a formula that makes decisions about the future based on the past. Why that matters for a lot of work that we do at the ACLU is that the past is complicated. The past is often it has generated information, it has generated data that is based on the discriminatory past practices of our own government, of we as people, And one prime example of that is actually in facial recognition. And that's a technology I do a ton of work on at the ACLU. As you saw discussed in the movie, the algorithms that run facial recognition that enable the software to recognize who we are and to identify us or seek to identify us, those algorithms are trained by submitting a lot of photos of people's faces to the algorithm, and using something called machine learning, the algorithm actually refines itself and writes itself by looking at a lot of data. So algorithms can be very straightforward in that it's like, take one input and add something to it, times something by it, incorporate more data, and then spit out an outcome. But where we're seeing artificial intelligence evolve is that algorithms are actually sort of teaching themselves and fleshing out their own contours based on data in the world. Why that's problematic in the facial recognition context is because the faces often being submitted to these learning algorithms have been white faces, white male faces, and not the faces that actually represent the societies that these technologies are designed to be used on. So that results in systems that have trouble seeing and recognizing faces that are not white. But it's not just the actual software algorithm, which I think was the really focus of the movie, that it has bias issues. It's really important to zoom beyond the algorithm too, and realize that like the actual way these are deployed is often biased and discriminatory, right? You have humans taking software, taking systems and using them against people. And there's a ton of room for more bias, more misuse, more bad outcomes for people's lives when a biased algorithm or even an unbiased algorithm and system is turned on society and used to make important decisions about people's lives. So that's a very sort of long, winding answer to your question, but I just want to sort of like expand on, what algorithms used to be and how they're sort of evolving in ways that are very complicated and that can often reflect back on us, the biases that exist in our society and in the decisions of the folks making the systems.
So that brings up, the next couple of questions. So in your experience, what are some current and typical uses of facial recognition software that are programmed with a similar kind of bias that we saw in the film?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is law enforcement, police agencies, and government agencies more generally are attempting to roll out, many of them are attempting to roll out facial recognition systems. Facial recognition systems, as the sort of label suggests, can be used to try and identify somebody. But if you can identify somebody, you can track them, right? If the community has cameras on every street light, if it's a community like Piedmont that has cameras at every entrance and exit to the city, if it's a place like New York City that has thousands and thousands of cameras, or London that has, I think in the movie they named a number that was sort of astronomically high amount of cameras, then each camera that has this software running on it can identify you in that moment, say when and where you were seen, and together you tie together those pinpoints on a map, and suddenly the government or whoever's running the system can know who you are, where you go, who you associate with, whether you appeared at a street corner with the local Black Lives Matter chapter to call for racial justice, whether you were at an immigrants' rights rally, whether you were going to the doctor or coming home from a therapist appointment. So facial recognition can be used to identify, it can be used to track and locate. And those are often the use cases that we're seeing in the world when it comes to law enforcement. What we've also seen here in California and actually in a lot of states is facial recognition be used to verify whether somebody is eligible for unemployment benefits. Very problematic because it has created barriers to people obtaining the employment benefits to which they're entitled. It has also been used here in California by the state bar during COVID to verify the identities of applicants sitting down to take the bar at their home on their computer. And we heard anecdotes in 2020 about Black and brown would-be lawyers having their software reject them when they were trying to take the bar. And this is after, of course, going to many years of law school, paying thousands of dollars to register for the bar, and trying to enter a profession that is already way too lacking in diversity. So those are some areas where we're seeing facial recognition be deployed. But algorithms, as you saw in the movies, are being used in all number of decision-making processes that governments run, whether it's to decide whether a person is eligible for bail based on often opaque factors and corporate algorithms. We've also seen it be used to control access to public housing buildings, as you saw in the movie. And really, unfortunately, the sky's the limit. You have vendors who, in terms of use cases, the sky's the limit, because you have vendors who are aggressively promoting these technologies to governments, often when they're not necessary, often when they have significant bias problems. And as the movie shows, it can have a really intense and harmful impact on people's lives.
Yeah, I'll say. So, okay, so let's go back. I'd love to go back to, or not go back, but reconsider. So in addition to facial recognition software, you mentioned algorithms that use all kinds of AI and that sort people, such as evaluating job applicants, a loan, medical insurance, housing, who gets accepted into a school. You mentioned perhaps, well, this was facial recognition with taking the bar. That's charming. That's very charming. And who's charged with a low bail or no bail. And there have been cases where in the criminal justice system, which you of course know, the software determines sentencing or the length of a sentence. So what are your thoughts on how these algorithms can be, what do I want to say, made more user fair, which is not really a word, but you know what I mean? I mean, how you know what I mean? Instead of just relying on these algorithms, how can they be used in ways to be actually much more fair?
That's a great question. I think the movie sort of tees up that question of like, how do we fix this? How do we make it better? So the government use of algorithms currently, and as we've seen, the trend is that there's more and more of that happening. Often those algorithms are created by corporate entities who are making a buck by selling the government software that the government is made to believe it needs. And these algorithms are being used to make meaningful decisions about people's lives. Traditionally, when the government makes meaningful or basic decisions about people's lives, people have a right through the concept of due process to understand that how and why the government is making a decision about them, have an ability to contest that decision, and have an ability to sort of interrogate the decision and the decision maker, whether it's you being accused of a crime and being able to face your accuser, or whether it's your ability as a criminal defendant, for instance, to ask the other side, ask the government for the evidence against you so you can understand it and make sure that you understand how things are going. But even in like the non-criminal context, we have the ability to frequently appeal decisions the government makes about us, understand and have notice of those decisions. Algorithms really complicate that because they place things behind this black box. They place things behind a curtain, and people are having trouble across the United States really understanding these things. So transparency, as you suggest, is a huge problem with these algorithms. But it's not just due process and sort of the idea of understanding and knowing the algorithms that comes up here with things like facial recognition. There are also privacy issues, right? If the government can analyze more data or information about our lives, they can know more about us than may have been knowable had humans without computers been watching us or trying to analyze reams of data about us. Algorithms and computers make it possible for the government to learn things about us that they would not have ever been able to learn before the time of supercomputers that we have now. That's a meaningful difference, because if you can, if fewer human hours and effort is necessary to figure things out about us and to learn about us, that gives the government more power. You know, that gives the government more power to surveil us, frankly, to control us than they had before. So whether it's tracking on the street using facial recognition, or the government running an algorithm to assess your eligibility for unemployment benefits based on an unemployment history purchased from a data broker who is selling that up to make a buck, there are serious implications to the privacy and the sort of meaningful life that you can live because of these algorithms. And then, of course, there's free speech concerns as well. If the government is using algorithms to analyze your activities and your speech and your expression, they're scanning your face at a protest and putting you on a list with the people you're standing, locked in arms with at that protest, that's an associational free speech concern. Your ability to engage in public protest or to walk down the street and speak your mind is potentially chilled if the government is watching. And obviously many government agencies have a dark history of targeting movements and dissidents for their viewpoints and targeting people who are calling for justice, frankly. We've seen this in our own work plenty of times here at the ACLU, and we see it today. So what can we do to fix? I think there are serious problems with transparency, as you said and suggested. But I also want to flag something that I don't think gets enough treatment in the documentary, which is sometimes an algorithm is not going to be the right thing. Sometimes there are going to be decisions that should be made wholly by humans, primarily by humans, and should be subject to human control and the control of you and the control of all of us, and not the control of or influenced by an algorithm. In the facial recognition context at the ACLU of Northern California, working with our allies, we have tried to lead on this kind of concept, which is we can say no. Just because technology improves and moves forward does not mean it's inevitable that the technology is going to be used to oppress us or to target marginalized communities. So in 2019, I walked into San Francisco City Hall, for instance, to meet with a supervisor who was interested in doing something to regulate surveillance. And having talked with Black and Brown allies and having talked with ACLU colleagues who were working on these issues, I said on the spot, what if San Francisco banned facial recognition? You're interested in regulating surveillance. We think that facial recognition is too harmful and is not fit for government use. And on the spot, the legislator said, okay, yeah, let's do that. Let's ban facial recognition. I was surprised because then it meant we had our work cut out for us in San Francisco to pass legislation that had never been passed in the world. So we worked with local community groups for many months, groups representing criminal defendants, the unhoused, immigrants, the AAPI, Asian American community, and we passed the first ban on facial recognition at the government level against government use. And that really set off like the dominoes. Now there are 20 bans in the United States. And so it's not just about transparency. I think that's really important. It's also about taking back control, right? And being the ones in a democracy, being the ones who decide whether this technology is ever appropriate for government use. And that's going to depend on the context, of course.
So it kind of brings up the last question, but I'm going to keep in line of the questioning. So you mentioned, governments, local governments, city governments. Who are the biggest users of this technology?
It's mostly police agencies. From what we're seeing, there's a lack of general transparency. Not about the algorithms, but in terms of how it's used. When I say transparency right now, that's what I mean. There's a huge lack of transparency and oversight when it comes to surveillance technology more generally. Since September 11th and the September 11th attacks, there's been a flood of federal grant money being sent down to communities, law enforcement agencies, that has been ostensibly earmarked for terrorism, but has been available to use on any number of surveillance technologies that can track, who we are, where we go, who we talk to. And so when I joined the ACLU 10 years ago, we were already seeing a massive increase in the use of surveillance systems, whether it was cameras or cell phone trackers or social media tracking software. And it's often in the law enforcement context that we're seeing that growth, and whether it's facial recognition or anything else. And what happens is when, whether it's federal money funding it or whether it's a free software product that police can try out from a unscrupulous vendor, when the money is flowing and when the cost isn't significant, that actually creates sort of democratic oversight issues, because no longer do the police have to go to the city council to ask for the use of local taxpayer dollars if they can just get a grant from the Department of Homeland Security to deploy cell phone tracking devices. So that contributes to the lack of oversight locally and the lack of transparency locally. We've been working with partners for years to fight back against that status quo by working with partners, coalition partners, to pass oversight ordinances that push all of this surveillance out of the shadows. Those are very difficult to pass, but now there are more than 24 of those in the United States. Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco, Davis, Palo Alto, each have one of these ordinances, and they require that the democratic process, local leaders, and the public actually have a voice in these decisions about surveillance, whether it goes forward or not. So yeah, go ahead.
Let's say, following that track, does the public have a say in surveillance after the fact, like once the surveillance is in place, and then oops, there are many, or maybe some covered up, but enough pushback against from the public because of intrusion in privacy or misidentifying someone, so is it only then that the public finds out, oh, guess what, they're using this technology? Oh, do you know what I mean? I mean, how does that work?
So we often make the point to policymakers and to the public that it's often too late to reel in surveillance systems once programs have been built out and deployed. It's not impossible by any means. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's better to attack these things on the front end and have a conversation about these systems on the front end rather than to unleash them on a community and then figure it out later. And that's often what we hear technology vendors saying, let's wait until we see misuse in order to clean this up or something. But if, it's sort of obvious the sort of problem with that. We've already seen in at least 3 different cases, Black men be misidentified by facial recognition in the hands of police, and that lead to their arrest. And thankfully, those folks realized that there was misidentifications and the software misidentified their Black faces, but not before they were arrested, sometimes in front of their children in their front lawn, for crimes they didn't commit, which derailed these men's lives, and thankfully did not result in an officer involved, officers pulling their guns and shooting somebody, or a conviction for a crime they didn't commit. So we have to scrutinize and examine these things and make decisions about them before they're beta tested on our communities. Absolutely.
So if so let's say some of this, it still sounds a little bit like the Wild West with this technology, in terms of let's just try it out and see how it plays. And if, let's say, law enforcement, if police departments are having pushback because we arrested the wrong person, we identified the wrong person, and then there are lawsuits and whatever, why not then just hire humans in the first place instead of relying on technology that, let's say, was cheap or given to them, or whatever, that could potentially, yes, humans also make errors, but at least with a human, it's like a face-to-face, and it's not sort of looking at sort of a black box that seems to be kind of inviolate. It never makes a mistake, when in fact we all know, well, it may not make a mistake, but it may be misprogrammed, so hence the mistake. So I'm just wondering, why not use humans instead?
That's a great question. I think, and you're not suggesting this, but humans have their own bias and discriminatory, they're prone to bias and discrimination. Discrimination law was built upon the mistakes of humans and the discrimination of humans and not computers. And so you're not suggesting that humans are infallible. You said as much. I think a big part of why you see so much surveillance technology being promoted and deployed is that there's sort of an unholy alliance between the vendors who are seeking to make a profit by selling governments and police agencies algorithms or software that they hold up as a solution to whatever the problem is or perceived problem is of the day. So there's profit incentives at work, and there's power incentives at work. Surveillance systems, when they do work, can be very powerful at creating a perception of safety, if not the actual safety itself, which is a key thing, but also the perception of control. And that's something that government agencies often want. So there's profit, there's power, there's control. That was mentioned, like, I think very well by Kathy O'Neill in the movie. She's like, this is all about power. And I would add, it's about control as well. And what we at the ACLU say is, we're not against technology. Sometimes we may take an opposition position to something like facial recognition in police hands or government hands, but we're not against technology. We think modern technologies should serve us, all of us. We think we, the people, should be in control of how technology gets incorporated into our lives or not. But all too often, governments and technology vendors work together to shore up systems of injustice, and technology and surveillance technology can be used to fuel that.
So, having said that, what are some of the repercussions and pushback to using this technology?
Well, I think I've talked about some of them already. So in certain contexts, what we've seen is movements to ban technology. We led the campaign in San Francisco to pass the first ever ban on facial recognition technology. And that really started a conversation about whether or not that would ever be appropriate for government use. And many, I think 20 other cities in the United States have banned it. As the documentary mentions at the end, there now been federal ban legislation and moratorium legislation introduced. When I started working on facial recognition issues in a more focused way in like 2018, we were laughed at when we suggested that the Congress or any government would ever consider saying no to something like facial recognition technology. Literally, we're not taken seriously. We were told that that was like magical thinking. And I think having gone through the gauntlet of working with community partners, working as a lawyer, working as essentially a community organizer at times to pass bans on this technology, like, that's not the way it has to be. Like, you can create the world you want to see if you work with your partners and your community members. So I think that's some of the pushback, and it's been some of the most inspiring pushback I've seen and in the work that I've done on surveillance, just to see how people have wanted to take back control of that particular technology in the government use context. We've also seen the kind of ordinances and laws that I mentioned that for all surveillance systems at the local level can subject them to democratic oversight and review. So that's another form of pushback, because it puts more power back into the hands of elected leaders and the public. And it makes it so that these decisions aren't just being made behind closed doors by police or governments with surveillance vendors acting sort of alone. We've also seen coalition efforts to call on companies to change their practices. We've been part of efforts to call out Amazon and Microsoft, which you saw mentioned in the movie as having flawed facial recognition systems, or at least Amazon's flaws were mentioned. We worked with Black and Brown allies for 2 years, calling on Amazon to stop selling facial recognition to governments. So to make a corporate decision on its own to not engage in that line of business. It's not in the legislature, it's not litigation. Those are things I do as well. But we also worked on a shareholder proposal calling on Amazon to do the same, and added pressure in that way with some activist shareholders. And ultimately, thanks to the 11th hour push by the Black and Brown activists who were leading the George Floyd protests, those companies decided to get out of that business, like Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, and Axon, which is a body camera company, a police body camera company. decided within the course of like 2 months that they were going to get out of the business. So there's corporate advocacy angles as well, in addition to the legislative and the litigation spheres I was talking about.
So, but it, one of the questions that just came up for me is that it almost, regardless of the list of questions that I have, but it still seems like it's almost like that the technology is in place and then it's up to us to act against it. Yes?
I don't think so. I think there are plenty of departments who are trying this stuff out. I don't think the battle's not lost by any means, and systems that are in use by governments are still, we still are the boss of the governments, the people, like they work for us, law enforcement agencies work for us. And so while the stakes of the battle and the sort of posture of the battle might be different in any community, if the police are already using something, there's no reason, no like reason for certain why those fights can't be had, and a community can't say, hey, this is not something we want in our community. Come to a city council meeting, come to the state legislature and explain yourself and account for this. I think it's important to remember that there's still a lot of places where there is not significant surveillance technology use. And it's the vendors and the police who want us to think that we're awash in this and there's nothing we can do, right? Like that this is inevitable,
Right.
Before, and that's absolutely not the case. When we banded together with folks in San Francisco to pass legislation there, San Francisco already had an arsenal of surveillance technology, everything from license plate reading technology that watches drivers as they drive along, to cameras, to drones. That didn't stop us, that obviously motivated us in some ways, because we saw the arsenal and why it needed to be reined in. I can't think of a single community, in fact, where these kinds of laws have been passed to regulate and oversee surveillance where there wasn't any surveillance yet, right? It's just sort of we're meeting the communities and the arsenal where it's at and having that conversation. It's a different conversation than if the police have not purchased something yet, but it's not an insurmountable one, and it's a battle we've won in partnership many times.
So, I was just going to say, one of the, and this is talked about in, let's say, users of surveillance. One of the more chilling points in the film is that no one really knows how the technology works. At least this is what was, prominent in the film, that the algorithms do function like a black box, and making decisions and based on a history of choices and selections and creating a profile. But nobody knows how the technology is read and sorted. And yet this is being used to identify us, define us, maybe even work against us. So, the ACLU, let's say, has gone to, Amazon, but how can we, citizens, hold the makers of AI software accountable?
That's a great question. I think I know that California, the state legislature, is really active in regulating technology and getting into questions of technology. So while I'm not aware of a bill right now that seeks to say, require transparency or accountability or explainability on algorithms, those kinds of proposals have been made in other states. And if they were put forward here, that would be something that folks can get involved in and contact their state legislator. Folks can work at the local level to ask their city or county governments what technologies are being used, and to ask the government with its own pocketbook, its own treasury, to make decisions about which technologies, to be picky about which technologies it uses or doesn't use. The community can say, we don't want our money, we don't want the community's resources to be spent to support this kind of algorithmic decision-making system. The first, I think, important step is probably to demand a transparency and an accounting of what is actually in a community. The law that I was referring to that we've passed in a number of communities requires that kind of accounting, but that accounting can be made if you had an allied city council member who wanted to ask questions of some city departments, or sort of public records requests are sometimes available to do that sort of thing as well. So I think understanding what's happening locally, pushing for scrupulous practices when it comes to algorithmic incorporation of algorithms into government decision making, asking for more action on this issue from state legislators, I think is another thing you can do. If you're involved with investment groups or something, you can vote with your investment dollars as well. We've been connected with activist investors before. We've done shareholder proposals, which can be pretty effective in shifting the conversation at the corporate level. They're often an uphill battle, but they are a great opportunity to put a spotlight on an issue and force the executive suite of a large company to grapple with something.
So
I'm going to jump in here. Denise, I don't know if you can see me.
yes.
Matt, I hope you both can see me. I'm Anita Stapin, and I'm a member of the Appreciating Diversity film series. And in terms of time,
Yes.
it's getting a little later. It's about 5:37, and we want to have time to answer the questions from our audience members. So if it's okay with you both, I will give that a go. Yeah.
Wow, man. Well, I only had 2 more questions, but Matt actually kind of answered them in his really in-depth, okay, go for it. Thank you,
Answers.
Matt.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll come back to you, Denise, for our ending goodbyes and thank yous. So right now, I have gotten quite a few questions from our audience. And Matt, I know this may not be your area of expertise, so just if it's off, let me know. But it's kind of a 3-part question. How do these tech companies gather all of this personal information on us? And what happens to it? And who owns it? I mean, that may be something that we all assume we understand, but I'm not sure we do.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a huge question because there's so many different ways companies use data about us, collect information about us. So how is it collected? I mean, this is speaking very generally and not about any particular company. It is often collected from us on the services that we use, right? It can be collected from us directly when we sign up for something and volunteer information. More often than not, the sort of online ecosystem is actually propagated with data or information by sort of the more surreptitious behind the scenes gathering of your activities as you do them on these services. So
tracking.
As I scroll Instagram or Facebook, information, everything about what I'm doing is being recorded by those companies and being saved, and the company then can make decisions about how they make money based on that information. So how long I scroll on something, what things I like or don't like, whether I comment on something, whether I click an ad or not, whether I hover over an ad, what websites I go to while I'm also on that service, when I switch apps or when I go to a new tab. Facebook and Instagram, for instance, will track what I do on the Williams and Sonoma website or something like that. Like, there's tracking by many websites across the internet, not just through the sort of depth of an individual service. And the information is often things that I will provide, but more often than not, the richest information are the sort of things that are observed about me while I'm on the service or on another service.
I see.
How do they use it? They use it to make money. For the most part, they use it to try and make money, at least. There's serious questions out there from like respected scholars about whether something like targeted advertising, which is the practice of taking information and trying to make ads that are relevant to us. There's serious questions about whether that even works and whether it actually makes more money and makes ads more effective. But at the end of the day, the biggest companies out there, whether it's Google or Facebook or Twitter or something, are making money off of our information by trying to sell advertiser our eyeballs or That's typically the way, actually, that's most of the internet's business model is advertising. It's
So
not more sophisticated than that.
it's sold by the companies
Right,
to
yeah,
other
it's sold, it's
companies.
essentially sold to the highest bidder who was willing to put
Mhm.
an ad before us. Sometimes companies will also literally sell the information too. There's an entire dark and unregulated industry out there called data brokers. The most obvious version to all of us is like Experian and the credit bureaus.
Mhm.
But there's plenty of data brokers that we don't ever see as people who are in the business essentially of buying and selling information from unscrupulous apps like weather apps who want to sell it to them, or an app that maybe collects your location information, or they take that and they combine it with public records they obtained from the county assessor about what property you own, or
Right,
what
right.
bills you have due with the county or the city. So
So,
data brokers are kind of like often don't have a consumer face,
mhm.
and they also engage in the business of selling our personal
So
information.
then how do the algorithms get our data? For example, a facial recognition algorithm program, or a program that assesses whether we can take the bar, or a program that assesses whether we can get a loan. How do those programs get our data at the time that, say, we apply for a loan?
Sometimes it's similar mechanisms I described. Like sometimes they will just straight up ask for it in the employment, facial recognition, employment benefits, unemployment
Mhm.
benefits question. I think my understanding is they simply ask for a photo of you and your ID,
Oh,
and they demand the information from you. Just similar to what I said about the targeting ad system online. Another way that it's often obtained, though, is like without our consent or knowledge whatsoever.
right.
So one of the biggest players in facial recognition right now, one of the biggest companies, is called Clearview AI. And they built a massive database. They say billions of photos of people's faces from all over the world. We presume all of our faces. And they did this without our consent or knowledge by scraping or scanning internet websites, social media websites, photos of us on Google Images, anywhere their system could find photos of us online. They sought those photos out, and then they built a huge database of photos that can then be sold to the government as a surveillance system, essentially.
Right.
That's obviously a horrible thing. It's something that none of us consent to or want to be happening. But that's their business model. Another way I should say that the systems are built is like the information the government collects. One of the problems we've highlighted with something like facial recognition is, for instance, that the databases that the government often has of the faces are databases of mugshot photos. That's problematic because that means you're making the surveillance system built upon the history of policing in that particular community. Often that history of policing is going to be racially biased policing or have problems of racial bias.
Mhm.
So if there are more Black and brown faces in that set of photos, when the system is ultimately turned on a community, the system may by default be looking for matches with those photos, the Black and brown faces that disproportionately populate the database.
Hmm.
So there's just a number of ways that, yeah, the algorithms can see our data.
Actually, a friend, this is not quite, well, my friend put the question in. She is helping a neighbor who doesn't have many resources to apply for unemployment benefits. And the program will not read his face. He is a dark-skinned person. She just wonders, what should she do? Should she report it to the ACLU? She should go, I mean, what do you do when these facial recognition programs fail? You know, they fail the person they're supposed to help. What's the best recourse?
So that's super horrible. And it's a problem that we've heard about. My understanding, and I think your friend should look into this, but my understanding is that there may be an alternative option in California that
She's
does
not in
not.
California though.
Oh, okay. Well, it's worth checking whether that state provides an alternative that doesn't require facial recognition. It may require some hoops. That shouldn't require any hoops, obviously.
Yeah.
But that might be an option. But I think what you're illustrating is exactly one of the key problems with rolling out algorithmic decision making that impacts people's lives and ability to like feed themselves and put a roof over their head or be free and stay out of jail, is that like when the systems go wrong, it can have real effects on people's lives. Significant harm can compound itself very quickly if somebody is put in jail for a crime they didn't commit or can't pay their rent or their mortgage. And again, though, like, and I think the movie touches on this a little bit, it's not just the problem of these systems being inaccurate. It's horrible if something like facial recognition is inaccurate, but we should also be very concerned about perfectly accurate facial recognition or perfectly accurate but opaque algorithms that make significant decisions about our lives. It's not like sort of either or, it's like two areas of concern, unfortunately.
Right. Do the companies that provide these programs have any responsibility to anyone? I guess you could say to us as citizens, to cities, to civil rights groups. What is the responsibility that companies have for these harms?
I mean, in the big picture sense, they absolutely have responsibility to not release systems and promote systems that are going to be used to shore up unjust systems of power in our society that are going to be used to harm people and withhold people from meaningful, healthy, safe lives. Often that responsibility, that sort of moral responsibility, is not heeded by these companies. In terms of legal responsibility, there are not enough restrictions legally in many places on what companies can or can't do when it comes to releasing dangerous algorithms into the world. You're starting to see more and more lawmaker scrutiny on and civil rights community scrutiny on these companies. The ACLU has actually sued my colleagues at the ACLU National Project, have actually sued Clearview AI, which is that facial recognition company, under a law in Illinois that has existed for over 10 years, and that gives people biometric privacy rights. So the ACLU is actually in court right now arguing that this company cannot be extracting face prints from our images without our consent, and that they've run afoul of that law, which has severe penalties. And so we're excited that more states might pass laws of that type. But you're totally right, though. Or your suggestion is, I think, totally right, that there's just not enough responsibility in this space, but that whether it's from lawsuits like that or legislative actions that are coming to the fore, we're going to start to see more of that for sure.
Well, that's good news after bad news, I guess. I actually have quite a few more questions, but I want to make sure that we don't go over our time. I think we have about 5 more minutes. Let me see.
Oh, it's 5:48.
Oh, 5:50. Yeah, is what my clock says. So I think we agreed that we would stop at 5:55 and do our wrap up with you, Denise. One viewer asked the question about how companies can target poor people with high credit card rates, high interest rates, and high home loan rates, and then profit on the when people can't pay the cards, and then they can go after them for collections, or they can foreclose on them. Do you have anything to say about that situation in light of AI programs?
That's a good question. I think many of us agree that they shouldn't be able to do that, of course. The reasons why companies can do that are multiple. I think one of the reasons is that we often do not know, because of the opaque nature of these systems and the lack of transparency into the practices, what is actually happening. And it's difficult for normal people like us to know how our information is being misused or abused, and why it is that we were rejected the home loan, or why it is we got this interest rate. or why it is that, this service is offered to us and it costs more than it was, when it's offered to our neighbors, or vice versa. And so we don't know. I think if we did know, we would probably see more lawsuits and more action from attorneys general and the FTC, because those kinds of practices, if they're predatory, if they're deceptive, if they're bad for consumers' welfare, they may run afoul of laws that have existed long before algorithms existed. So part of it is that we just don't know, and that technology and algorithms have enabled corporate players to hide their practices even more so. So that circles back to, one of the key challenges is getting more transparency for these kinds of practices, so people are actually in the driver's seat and understand what's going on.
I have one last question. What do you think are the best ways that we can find out what issues are happening in this realm, either online sources, etc., and what can we as individuals do in this realm to try and create more justice, more fairness?
Great question. Bit of self-promotion. Follow the ACLU of Northern California's work and the ACLU National's work.
Absolutely.
At both places, we have teams focused on technology. I'm on the Technology and Civil Liberties program team. At the National ACLU, they have the Speech Privacy and Technology Project. Check our websites. We're often blogging and putting out news stories about our latest work, our latest lawsuits. When we're working on legislation, we often mention it. I should add, to build on the San Francisco ban effort and the work we've done on facial recognition bans, we're actually working on a bill this year to make sure that police body camera surveillance is not used for surveillance. Essentially, police body cameras are not used to scan our faces. And so we haven't rolled out the public campaign on that yet, but that's a bill we'll be talking more about in the future. You should also look at the Electronic Frontier Foundation's website. They're an allied group who does wonderful work. They blog really frequently and have lots of really good public explainers. They often have know your rights materials that are on there. They have these on their website, not often. If you're wondering about how do I make sure my devices are safe and secure, and how do I assess how safe and secure they are if I go to a protest or if I'm crossing the border and traveling internationally. They have really great self-help resources.
That's great.
And what we can do, in California, we're lucky to have a very sophisticated governments and elected leaders. If you're hearing about bills at the state level from the ACLU or someone else and you want to get involved, that really, really does help. Constituent meetings with your elected leaders communicates things are priority to you if these issues matter to you. Do that with your state legislators, the senators and assembly members. Do it with your city council members and your boards of supervisors. Start talking to your neighbors about it and form a coalition of folks. Build that political power that you can create real change with.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Yeah.
Back to you, Denise. Signing off here.
Thank you, Anita. I was just going to say that my councilwoman is Chantal, and she is all over this. She's a really great council. We're really lucky to have her in Oakland. Okay, Matt Cagle, thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge and experience. And more importantly, actually, thank you so much for your work and dedication in monitoring and fighting the misuse of AI technology, which is commonplace. Also, I want to thank your employer, the American Civil Liberties Union, for upholding and protecting our civil liberties for over 100 years. I could go into the history of the ACLU, I won't, but it's a really great history. Thank you, Women Make Movies, for providing us free access to Coded Bias, and for the 40+ years of supporting the work of independent women filmmakers around the world. Go indie filmmakers. And as always, thank you, Appreciating Diversity Film Series moviegoers and supporters. Please visit our website, diversityfilmseries.org, join our mailing list if you're not already on it, and register for our next upcoming film, The Power to Heal, directed by Charles Burnett and David Lowenthal, two really good filmmakers. Their film chronicles the history of Medicare and the long fight to guarantee equal and adequate healthcare for all. This Zoom discussion will be on May 5th. Stay tuned. I think that's it. Take good care of yourselves, your loved ones, your two-legged loved ones, your four-legged loved ones, all of them. Visit our website. Enjoy your evening. Thank you. Bye.